Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Access Nature Forum. I'm Sean Kane Holland. I'm the Access Nature Disability Advocate with Pinelands Preservation Alliance. Thank you all for joining us for this forum. The Access Nature Forum is set up for where through discussions we seek to make the outdoors more inclusive and accessible to those with disabilities. Through these discussions, we bring people from all various backgrounds, lived experiences, land managers to discuss barriers to accessing nature and ways to try to overcome these barriers. Um, just a couple of things to go over before we get started. I ask that everybody remain muted through the presentation and leave questions till the end. We do have the chat, so if you want to, you can write down your questions in the chat as we go along. If you can't, if you don't want to lose that thought, but I just ask that the vocal questions be left till the end of the presentation. I'm going to introduce now Peter Dolan. Peter Dolan is with the New York, New Jersey Trail Council. He's been with them for 11 years, where he acts as the trail program manager. And his team executes programs and projects across over 200 sites that are managed by various levels of land managers, state, federal, local, nonprofit, and oversees over 2,000 miles of trails in his program. But tonight we'll be listening to his presentation on sustainability and accessibility and how these two um, theories, intersect and connect. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter now to start the presentation.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to start screen sharing. So, Sean, I'll look to you to give me a thumbs up to just ensure that it comes through clearly. All right, I'm getting the thumbs up. So, like Sean said, my name is Peter Dolan. I'm with the Trail Conference, and I will be trying to keep an eye on the chat. So, don't be shy about popping questions in there real time so I can answer them as we go. And we'll definitely try to wrap up with time at the end for everybody to have a little more structured, like Sean said, verbal question and answer session if you'd like. So, with no further ado, let's jump into Accessible Trails for All. So, this presentation, first, I want to acknowledge the role of two people who contribute a lot, not just to the in service of accessible trails in the United States, but also personally who I've worked with and briefly had the privilege of learning from. First is Janet Zeller, who was the National Accessibility Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service, which is a critical role, and she was the lead author of two documents that we'll look at later in this presentation. And also Peter Jensen, who is a renowned trail builder, especially in our area of the world and the East Coast here. And Peter not only has led accessible trail construction and design efforts in our area and across the country, but he also is a president of the Professional Trail Builders Association, which is a major pillar of the trail building community. So for this presentation, the next 45 minutes, I hope to cover first an introduction to the Trail Conference for those who aren't yet familiar with us. My own personal experience with accessibility issues and why it's so important to me personally. A definition of accessibility that I think serves us as a trail community. Some legislation that informs when, why, and how we implement accessibility improvements on trails. The connection, like Sean said, between accessibility and sustainability. Those are two big major buzzwords in the trail building community, and luckily for us, they have a lot in common. And we'll wrap up with some accessible design elements beyond just tread and slope. And then we'll have a call to action, which I call the don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And the goal is that everybody here can leave the presentation feeling a little more empowered to make accessible improvements to trails where you see them without being burdened by the idea that everything has to be perfect all the time, because that can be paralyzing. And finally, we'll have some resources. So Sean will be able to send out a PDF of this presentation. I'm going to go pretty quickly at some points, and there's a lot to cover, but you'll be able to go through at your own leisure and click through those resources at the end of this presentation. So the Trail Conference, where I'm coming from, The Trail Conference is a volunteer-directed organization, and that makes us pretty unique and special because we have volunteer committees who often serve as the figureheads and on-the-ground leaders of our committees and our decision-making process, supported by a staff team of which I'm part. Through that model of volunteer-led activism, we've been developing, building, and maintaining trails for over 100 years, since 1920. We protect trail lands through support and advocacy, and we educate the public in responsible trail use in the natural environment. So today, on this map, you can see in yellow the counties where we're active. We've got lots of members and member organizations, which is why we're called a conference. And through that model of volunteer and club and member-based maintenance, we oversee about 2,150 miles of trail, including big name premier trails like the Appalachian Trail, Highlands Trail, Long Path, the SRT, and over 200 individual parks, nature preserves, and areas. Most people know about us through our maps, but we also have trail crews, both volunteer and conservation corps models, ecological stewardship and invasive species removal, books and guides, and we have a headquarters building in Mahwah, New Jersey, where we run programming up in the northern region. So with that, my own personal experience with accessibility. On the left, there are two children. I am the less adorable of the two, the kind of grubby looking one on my father's lap. The other child is my brother, Jamie, who has Down syndrome and cerebral palsy. And Jamie has always been part of our hiking outdoorsy family. The picture on the right shows him on a more recent trip, camping that was up in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, where we did a kayaking and hiking trip. So Jamie is very outdoorsy. Again, he's happiest when he's out with his brothers doing something in the outdoors. And from a young age, we've always just been aware of what makes a good experience for our family. What are we all going to appreciate? What can we all do? And what's going to have us all coming home happy and fulfilled rather than frustrated or held up because the experience wasn't accessible to everybody. And beyond Jamie, I think we all, when we think about our lives, have people who have unique needs. And some of those needs are invisible, meaning you wouldn't see them just by looking at someone. And some of them can be ephemeral, meaning that they come or go. From week to month, someone's abilities can change. One example is my wife has asthma. So there are a lot of considerations that we consider when we're planning a hike. Everything from altitude gain over the mileage to the weather conditions. Is it cold and dry or is it warm and humid? Because those are the sort of things that might impact the kind of outdoor experience we can have on a given day. My wife's best friend has Crohn's, meaning that the facilities available at a trailhead are what determine for her whether or not she can participate in an experience we're planning. Beyond that, I've got friends who, before I dragged them out by the nose, had never been backpacking before. Friends with muscular dystrophy. One of my best friends lives in Jersey City and doesn't own a car, so he has virtually no access to a lot of the experiences that I enjoy up where I live. My mother recently had a massive change in what she can do in the outdoors thanks to a recent spine surgery. My father has arthritis, which can come and go. My sister-in-law doesn't have any physical disability, but isn't comfortable hiking alone. So that puts a lot of limits on when, where, and how she can interact with the outdoors. And also, as of 2 years ago, I've got this little guy in my life, my nephew, who just turned 2 years old. And as much as I love him, I'll admit he's got stumpy legs and poor stamina. So when we're planning an outdoor hike with him, those are things we need to consider. So when you think about all the people who have different levels of access and different levels of comfort, different levels of physicality when they engage with the outdoors, how can we define accessibility in a way that's broad enough to consider all these people and their needs? And that's where we get to defining accessibility. So what is accessibility? The first thing I always say, and I put it in bold, this does not just mean wheelchair accessible. And I think this is one of the hardest things to get past when we have talks about improving accessibility to the outdoors, is getting people to shift from a binary idea that trails are either yes accessible or no, they're not accessible. And I want to move towards something that's a little more nuanced and captures what we talked about before with everybody who you know and all of their unique needs. So when we talk about accessibility for trails, I always encourage thinking of accessibility as designing in a way which excludes the minimum amount of people. Some people also use the term trails for all, including this presentation title. as something which is a little more inclusive rather than just simply accessibility. So excluding the minimum amount of people means considering that each design aspect or structure along a trail has the potential to serve as a filter that can keep someone from passing any further. Sometimes this is done with intention. If we're doing a trail building project in an area that has illegal ATV use, we might intentionally design things like pinches in the trail width so that ATVs can't go any further along the trail. But sometimes it's unintentional, like a water bar on a trail that prevents a person who uses a wheelchair from passing any further because it presents a small wall from they can't get over. Similarly, you could have a trail that's flat and level and firm, but it has one section that's a scramble over loose rock where somebody who has impaired balance, like my brother, isn't comfortable going any further and might have to turn around, and so on. So we think of accessibility as maximizing the utility by our target demographic. Who do we want to be able to enjoy this trail? And how do we remove all the barriers that might keep those people from being able to participate? So here's a snapshot of Disability New Jersey, produced by Rutgers University. And you can see just from the numbers, I won't go through all of them, but hundreds and thousands of people in this state who have ambulatory difficulty. So that's a motility issue where they might need adaptive gear or a wheelchair to get around on their own, but also hearing difficulty, cognitive difficulty, vision difficulties. These are all things that we also need to consider in trail design. Disability often comes with aging. So I'll tell people, even if you're the most selfish person in the world and you have no interest in making accessible trails for other people, consider that you yourself at some point will almost inevitably acquire a disability of some sort, and you want to make sure that you're going to have experiences that you can enjoy as you age. Beyond that, we've got family and friends. So take those numbers from before, those hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities, and multiply that several times over for all the people who love them and want to experience the outdoors with them. So with that talk of accessibility, meaning designing in a way to exclude the minimum amount of people or maximizing utility by a target demographic, it's clear that whenever we make something for the public to use, we need to consider the needs of people who have disabilities or a loved one with a disability. So to bring it back on topic, how do we assess and improve trail accessibility for everybody? I want to credit Maya and Ziv with the Access Outdoors project, who gave a really fantastic presentation specifically on this issue of trail accessibility, how to assess it, document it, and share that information. So in the PDF that you'll all get after this presentation, you'll have a link to that, and I highly encourage watching that. But to pull out the one, I thought the most important graphic from that presentation, here are the 6 things that the Access Outdoor project shows as critical for someone to know before they select an experience, which is what's the terrain, what are the amenities, what are the access points, what are the points of interest, because everybody deserves to have a trail that has value and interest and landmark, and we're not going to send them off on boring walks to nowhere. What are the hazards and what closures might be in effect? So those are all the factors that go into considering accessibility on a trail. And then the next question people often ask is, all right, so that's maybe how I assess it, but when do I have to? When does disability or accessibility have to be a consideration in a project I'm planning? So the most quoted acronym when it comes to accessibility issues is the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. And essentially, this act states that governments, programs, and facilities are not to exclude people because of a disability. So the act exists to prevent discrimination. The ABA, or the Architectural Barriers Act, is more directly applicable to trail construction, because in this act, the ABA is where we can find technical standards that structures, buildings have to comply with if they're designed, constructed, or frankly, even glanced at sideways by the federal government. So if you're doing a trail project that is going to involve any sort of federal involvement, then the ABA is going to be the guiding document you look to. Within that, we have 2 specific U.S. Forest Service documents that guide us in trail construction. So these are the FSTAG and the FSORAG, which we'll explain in a second. And one thing that also always deserves definition is, what is a trail? I think trail is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. It's very popular. Everything these days is called a trail. But for the purposes of this documentation, we call trails pedestrian routes developed primarily for outdoor recreational purposes. And I underlined recreation because that's the key word there. A pedestrian route that connects elements, spaces, or facilities is not a trail. So, for example, a connecting pathway between a parking lot and a visitor center, or a visitor center and a restroom. People are probably not walking that distance between the parking lot and the restroom for purely recreational purposes to enjoy the fresh air. It's connecting a facility or a site that people need to have access to. So those connecting pathways need to be held to a higher standard of accessibility. That's why we have two documents. The first, the FSORAG, or the Forest Service Outdoor Recreation Accessibility Guidelines. I underline the keyword there again, is primarily concerned with facilities. So if you're building that parking lot, that visitor center, that restroom connectivity, you need to follow the guidelines in this document. And those are going to be to a higher standard. That's the reason sometimes people wonder if you're building let's say, a privy, a restroom on the top of a mountain, and you can't get to the top of the mountain unless you're a rock climber. Why does that restroom need to be wheelchair accessible? And this is the reason, because it's not considered a recreational thing, it's considered a facility. For us as trail builders, we focus mostly on the guidance from the FSTAG, or the Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines. And this is where we find much more flexible and much more lenient guidance on how to build recreational pathways and trails that are accessible. So that's what we want to look at. So to put all the alphabet soups into a little narrative that makes sense, if we're building a trail, the ADA is what prohibits discrimination based on ability. To make sure that we as trail builders are not unintentionally discriminating based on ability, the ABA provides design standards. And within these design standards, we want to follow those outlined in the Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines, or if we're accessing developed areas, the Forest Service Outdoor Recreation Area Guidelines. So, does that make sense? I can only see one or two faces, so hopefully we're all following along. So to get to the nitty gritty, if you're building trails, your question is probably going to be, does this trail I want to build need to comply with the guidance in that Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guideline document? And the answer is, you only need to comply with that federal guidance if you're using federal funding, if you're building a brand new trail, and if that trail is designated for hikers and pedestrians, and that brand new federally funded trail for hikers and pedestrians connects to a trailhead or an existing accessible trail. If any one of those is not the case, or multiple of those are not the case, then you don't need to comply. So if you do need to comply, and you say, all right, I'm federal funding, it's all new, it's designated, it connects to a trailhead, even then there is some latitude in terms of what elements of the document need to be applied. So you can claim an exception for portions. For example, if the terrain would make it impractical, if you would alter the nature of the setting by building the trail in a certain way, if construction practices just simply don't allow you to build things to a certain standard, or if you have cultural, historic, or environmental reasons for not building the trail to a standard that would be accessible. The only catch there is that once you pass that area where you can't build the trail to accessible standards, you do need to return. So just because someone might have a short section of trail that's really rough for them doesn't mean they can't, at their own comfort level, push through that and continue. So you do want to make sure that after you have a non-compliant spot, you do your best to return to compliance. Only thing there is once you get past 15% of the trail being an exception, you don't want to have a trail where you say, yes, the trail is accessible except for 50% of it. At that point, you might as well just say it's a lost cause. Once it's impossible to make 15% or more of the trail accessible, then the whole thing you've done your diligence, you've done your best to look at it, and you can get a full exception for the trail. So some examples of things that allow for exceptions to accessible standards: a steep sandy slope might be one example. It's going to be almost impossible to make that accessible. You may have historic structures like a stone wall, where to make it accessible, you'd have to rip out that wall, dig behind it, put down geotextile, fill it with imported gravel and crush, all things that would make a historian lose their marbles. So you might be able to say, okay, let's claim an exception there. Here on the right, we have a picture of a landscape that is notable and distinctive because of the craggy, rocky terrain. And to make it accessible, you might have to completely remove everything that makes it unique and beautiful. So that would be a valid exception because the nature of the setting would be fundamentally altered. Other examples, shallow soils. Maybe on the right, that's an example of DEP says this is as far as you can go. Building anything beyond this is not allowed because of the disturbance. That might be a lost cause. So to wrap that up, the question, do federal accessibility guidelines mean that every single trail that's built forevermore needs to be, quote, wheelchair accessible? No, the answer is no. So you don't need to have every project be a big stone cribbing, flat level project. However, just because you don't have to make trails accessible doesn't mean there aren't great reasons to do so. So the rest of this presentation is going to say, now that you know the rules, here is my appeal to say, even if it's not necessary, we should always consider accessibility for all trail projects. Big part of that is that if you're building a modern sustainable trail, you're already moving a big part of the way towards having a trail that's accessible. So let's look at that connection between sustainability and accessibility. For those not familiar with the term, sustainability refers to trails that can hold up to the expected traffic and environmental conditions. So what that means is that the definition of sustainability can differ. You might have one trail that sees 10 people a year be sustainable. That same trail would not be sustainable if 1,000 people a year were hiking it. So sustainability is a combination of factors like local environmental conditions, weather, visitation, in addition to the construction standards you're dealing with. We always want to look at building trails sustainably because that's going to minimize our reconstruction and maintenance efforts in the long term. It'll minimize environmental impacts and damage, and it'll lead to the best experience for people visiting. And a common misconception that people have, and this is a very tongue-in-cheek picture, so this is making fun of the misconception that many people think that accessible trails have to be large and paved, and that if you build an accessible trail, it's going to lack the character of a traditional footpath and have more an environmental impact. And this presentation is here to say, no, that is not the case. That is not true. There are plenty of ways to build trails that are both accessible and sustainable. And in fact, the two different characteristics harmonize very, very well. So well-designed, sustainable trails are also more accessible. They go together. If it were a Venn diagram, this is maybe a little exaggeration, but you can see that a lot of the standards overlap. The same things that work for one are also good for the other. So we're going to look at a few of the most prominent examples of common best practices between accessible and sustainable trails. Most fundamental is the surface of the trail, what we are moving on top of as we enjoy our trail experience. Accessible trail standards mandate that your trail be both stable, which means that it can withstand normal wear and tear from use, and also firm, which means that it resists indentation. So for accessibility, you often think of if you took a narrow-wheeled bicycle and pressed down and rolled across the trail, would it leave a tire mark? If so, it's probably not firm enough. Now, those two characteristics, stable and firm, are also great for sustainable trail building, and that's what we always seek out for a sustainable trail. That's going to minimize the forces that act upon trail damage. Like on the right, you can see we've got a rut forming in that trail that's going to channel water. Those forces are compaction, which is the act of pushing down and forcing soil into a tight, dense, compacted form. Displacement, which is the kicking and moving of soil off the treadway. And erosion, which is the washing down the treadway from usually water flow. So when you've got your stable and firm surface, you're both accessible and you're going to be sustainable because your trail is not going to wear down. Then we have grades, which I think are the hottest topic when talking about accessibility. People really focus on the grade, also called the running slope, as one of the most important characteristics of an accessible trail. So here in the diagram, we see two kinds of slope. We have cross slope, which is if you're standing on a trail, how tilted outwards are you, versus running slope, which is as you're walking along the trail, how steep is your climb or your drop along the trail. One very frequent misconception I hear is that accessible trails have to be 5% slope or less. I hear that all the time, 5%, and people spew it out like it's gospel, and they are convinced that many trails would be impossible to make accessible because that 5% grade is so limiting. So it's true that the accessibility standards say that a trail can be up to 5% for any distance. The entire trail can be 5% running slope or grade and still meet the criteria. But it's also true that you can go up to 8.33% for as long as 200 feet. So that's a significant distance where you can exceed 5%. Beyond that, you can go up to 10% for a short spurt of 30 feet or less. And you can even go as high as 12% for a very short 10-foot distance. So that's a lot of latitude when it comes to laying out a trail that still meets all the Forest Service's standards for accessibility. Now, the only thing to keep in mind is that if more than 30% of the total trail exceeds 8.33, then it's going to fail the accessibility test. So you can do things like 12% for a short distance, but you can't say 12%, then flat, then 12%, then flat. At the end of the day, you've got to have an average that's going to be fairly low. When we talk about sustainability, those are also really good practices that we want to hold to, which is minimizing steep sections of trail. In this diagram, we see the running slope of the trail in black, so the 10%, 7%, 11%. And in sustainable trail design, the half rule says the running slope should never exceed the fall line slope. So that's the steepest part of the terrain you're traversing. I imagine if you're standing on top of a hill and you drop a marble and the marble rolls the most direct way downhill, that's the fall line. So here in this example, we see where the fall line's 14%, our trail can really only cap out at 7% slope. Or if the cross slope is, or the fall line is 22%, we're stuck at 11. So those accessible grades between 5% up to 12% should really keep us in line with sustainable best practices by keeping us from going too steep, by making sure we're being super conscious of grade when we design an accessible trail. It's also going to be much more likely to meet the sustainable trail building criteria and the half rule. And even with sustainable trail building, the cap is 15%. So that's very close to the 12% cap we have for accessible trail design. So once again, accessibility and sustainability are both really encouraging us to look at grades that are going to meet the needs of the user and the environment. Here's an example of a really common project that we get. So we're always going to state parks and pitching proposals like this. We might have a historic trail like Route A, which is, if you imagine this is a contour map, Trail A goes straight up. It goes from 20 feet to 40 feet to 60 feet to 80 feet in the most direct line possible. This is usually going to lead to erosion. So water, just like people, is going to choose the path of least resistance, and water will flow down that trail until it becomes a trench. So from a sustainable perspective, we might go to the park and say, we want to make a trail that's going to hold up better to use. It's going to cause less environmental damage. Will you give us permission to reroute like we see in Trail B, where the trail starts in the same place, it ends in the same place, but it's going to gently curve around the slope and get up to the top in a way that's a lot more sustainable. Notice that that relocation also happens to bring that 10% trail down into a comfortably accessible 5% grade. So in addition to being more environmentally sustainable, we might be able to go to the park and say, let's consider making this an accessible trail as well, and let's fall into line with those Forest Service guidelines for grade. Another thing for accessibility is the idea of an accessible resting interval. And an accessible resting interval gives someone a chance to take a break on an area of flat, level ground in the middle of an otherwise uninterrupted slope. So rather than slogging uphill, and especially if you're using a wheelchair, you have to be concerned when you're taking a break of, am I going to start rolling downhill? So building in resting intervals allows someone to truly relax and rest somewhere where they can take their hands off and enjoy the scenery. So that's the accessibility reason why these are required. In sustainable trail design, we actually have an almost identical concept, but we call it a grade reversal or grade dip. So a grade dip is designed to prevent water from rushing down a trail and causing erosion. So when you have a prevailing grade, which means an uninterrupted up or downhill area, you want to intermittently level the trail out, give a flat or a slightly dipped area, because water hates going uphill. So if you present a flat or an uphill area, the water will immediately stop going down the trail. And if you've sloped it right, it'll flow off the trail into the woods next to your path. So shedding water off the trail, preventing rutting out. And the end result is what we call here a rolling contour trail. You can see if the trail is designed to go down and then level and then down and then level, down, level, it's not going to have the water damage that we might see in an area like this, where it's uninterrupted with no chance for water to leave the trail surface. For an accessible trail, we would consider those rolling contours resting intervals. So almost the same thing. Both sustainable and accessible trail design call for these features in the trail to benefit both users and the sustainability of the trail surface. Beyond simple tread and layout and design, there are many other elements that can be considered for a trail to make sure that it's meeting the needs of all users. There are some that are really common, and I'm going to focus on some a little more novel and unusual ones, namely visibility and simplicity. So beyond the layout and design elements we talked about with slopes and grades, there are plenty of ways that we can all look at trails that exist and make sure that the trail markings, signage, and the overall design of the trail network is both visually and cognitively accessible to people, something that they can both see and understand quickly. These practices can reduce lost hikers and the damage that comes from either off-trail wandering or people looking to refine the trail. In addition, they help minimize search and rescue, which is going to impact the environment. The only time I've ever rode an ATV on public land was during a search and rescue call, where we had to deploy quads out in the woods to carry out someone who had an ankle injury. So search and rescue exists for a good reason, but it does result in practices that can be damaging. So we definitely want to make sure that people know what they're getting into before they get in over their head, both for their comfort and safety and for the environment's sake. Here's a quick example. Simply choosing the color paint you use for your trails can make it much easier for someone, especially if they have issues with vision, to tell where the trail is supposed to go. So for a blue marked trail, consider at a glance the difference between the blue on the left and the blue on the right. So for that reason, as a resource at the Trail Conference, we actually have a standard library of when we say green, this is the shade of green we mean. And when we say red, this is the shade of red we mean. And this exists both to make sure that we're maintaining trails in a consistent way to a consistent standard, but also because these are the colors that we've learned from experience are the most visible and provide the most contrast so that people can see them when they're out in the woods. Simplicity is the other part of this. So in addition to using those bright high contrast colors, we've recently been very involved with state and county parks in North Jersey to make trails more easily understood by people who aren't used to maybe being out in the woods, who might not have access to maps. So the benefits of making simpler trail loops rather than complicated trail networks include less reliance on different colors for navigation. So people often in a dense trail network might have to follow 3, 4, sometimes 5 colors to do a simple loop. And that can be really confusing for someone who isn't really that comfortable seeing colors. It leads to more intuitive navigation where simply you get on a color, you follow it back to where it started, and you're done, which can lead to less lost hikers versus having 4, 5, or 6 decision points and intersections that can lead to confusion. It also leads to less duplication of colors, which can give people more certainty about where they are. I've seen several trail networks that might have 3 or 4 trails of the same color, red, yellow, white, and it can be very confusing to figure out where you are there. And finally, there's an expectation that I found talking to people when they come out for a hike, that if they started a trail, they're just going to follow it until it brings them back where they started. And by bringing trail networks in line with the expectations of new users, we can give them an experience that's going to be better for everybody. The results of all of these changes have been overwhelmingly positive, both from park managers and search and rescue teams, who have confirmed our prediction that making these changes would reduce lost hikers. So here's one example of a trail network that had a long kind of out and back that ended in the middle of nowhere, spurs that kind of went from one trail back to it, duplication of colors within the small network, and an extensive network of unmarked trails that people would use. Afterwards, after looking at it and talking to visitors and park staff, each parking area got its own single colored loop. So you would park, follow a colored loop, come back to where you started. For experienced hikers, all the old trails are still there. They're able to have every hike that they love and know already But for new visitors or people who aren't used to the outdoors, this makes people a lot more comfortable and independent when planning their hike. Back to more traditional forms of accessibility, the signage that people have at trailheads is really important for shaping the experience they're going to have. And there are actually, in the federal rules for accessibility, there's guidance on what information needs to be presented in this sort of signage. So when you're using federal funds or on federal land, all those criteria we talked about earlier, any newly constructed or altered trails should include informational signs that explain the destination of the trail, the length, the surface type, the typical and minimum trail width, the typical and maximum trail grade, the tread cross slope. And this information helps everybody, not just people with disabilities. So this would allow, for example, say I wanted to start a hike at 8 a.m. and there was traffic and I didn't get there until 2 hours later. I've got to let less time. And if I have this information at my fingertips, I can decide, oh, am I still comfortable doing this? Is this trail something I can accomplish in the time allowed? Or if I show up and I have a sprained ankle, I might be able to say, ooh, that outslope that I see here is going to be really tough for me today. So this trail that might have been easily accessible to me a month ago, today, with that information at my fingertips, I know it's not something I'm going to be able to physically do. So this information is much better than simply saying accessible yes or accessible no. Because like we alluded to throughout this presentation, that yes or no determination about accessibility might be different for every single person. It might be different from the same person from one day to the next. So accessibility signage is not about saying whether it meets a check mark or doesn't meet a check mark, but by presenting information and letting people who know their own bodies, who know their own comfort levels, make the decision for themselves about what they want to do. One thing to consider when designing that kind of signage and content is color blindness. So we have resources like VizCheck is a website that lets you run simulations of signage that you're designing to say, how would this look to someone if they had different types of color blindness? And of course, it's no substitute for working with someone who has that lived experience and can really give you good feedback. But it's a way for people who do graphic design or who are involved in planning signage to make sure they're not accidentally designing signage that's not going to be useful to a good percentage of the population. You can see here the number that I found said an estimated 8 to 12% of men, which is incredibly high, have some form or some degree of color blindness. And I know actually several people that we work with, I think our most prominent hike leader and hike author and our executive director both have color blindness at the trail conference. So it's something that we're always very conscious of, with two of our most prominent people in the organization being conscious of this at all times. That's especially important when it comes to designing trail maps. So what we have in front of us, I intentionally blocked out where this is. So I don't know who this is, not trying to point the finger. I made sure it was out of New Jersey, so hopefully it's no one in the room. But this is an example of a map that looks really attractive. It's got lots of colors. Each trail has a different color. And then you've got a key that shows you which trail name goes to which colored trail. The issue is that if all those lines look the same to me, first of all, I have no idea of the color trail I'm on, and I have no idea of the name of the trail. So if I've got trail signs with names and a map with colors, I'm going to have a hard time putting those two together. Or if I get lost and need to call and say, I'm on this trail name, that's going to be a really difficult challenge for me because my map doesn't help me line up my current location to the name of the trail. That's why for our maps that we design, you can see there are no colors on the trail lines. Everything is solid red. Instead, we have each trail's name printed alongside the trail line. So there's no key that you have to cross-reference with a color. The name is right there. And there's a letter that indicates the color of the trail. So W is white, Y is yellow. So that way, even if I'm colorblind, I could be lost or I could be hurt. I could call 911 and I could say, I'm on the yellow trail at this location. Because just because I don't know the color of the trail or don't need to know it, doesn't mean that someone coming to help me won't need to know. So this is an example of maps that are really designed with that accessibility in mind. And one other thing I always like to ask people is, if I was presenting in person, I might ask, who here has some form of color blindness? And usually it's, one or two people. And then I say, I didn't say what time of day or what lighting conditions. because if the sun's going down and it's getting dark, the cones in your eyes don't work. And everybody's colorblind when the sun goes down. So I used to lead activities on night hikes where you'd hold up different color bandanas. No way to tell blue from red from green in the moonlight. So if you're designing a trail map that people might be looking at without a flashlight in the dark, you need to make sure that it's accessible to them at that point in the day when they're colorblind. So something to consider there. And wrapping up this presentation is that call to action that I alluded to at the start. And that call to action is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So lots of people think, I'm going to fall short of making this trail fully accessible, or this trail might be accessible to someone who maybe uses crutches, but it wouldn't be accessible to someone using a wheelchair. And because I'm not going to hit that gold standard, I'm not going to try it all. And what I want all of us to do as trail lovers or trail builders or land managers is to not be afraid of failing to meet every single accessibility standard, because with the budgets we have, with the resources we have, with the old trails we've all inherited, it's going to be impossible to make every trail accessible to every person. But as you think about all the things we talked about today, simply relocating to reduce grades might make it accessible to a new person. Or saying, when we do this drainage mitigation, let's not use water bars, let's use grade reversals. That's going to open up new people able to access the trail. So we always have ways that we can make every trail more accessible, even if we're not going to be able to reach everybody. So there it is in writing. Just because a project you're considering isn't going to be physically able or financially able to reach that full, perfect gold standard ADA or ABA federal accessibility standards, it doesn't mean that your efforts to continue to remove barriers where you see them aren't going to help more people enjoy your trails. And the way that I think about this is, when I hike, I imagine starting that excursion with that same group of friends and family I mentioned earlier. So my friends who have Crohn's, who have asthma, who have muscular dystrophy, my little tiny 2-year-old nephew. I imagine all of us just got off a bus and we are at the trailhead. And every step you take, every 10th of a mile you go, you can ask yourself, at what point in my trip today would one of those people have had to turn back? And the next question is, how could we have changed the trail so that everybody would still be here? And I think if we ask those two questions as we look at trails, as we seek grants and projects to improve trails, you don't have to reach everybody. It's not always going to be possible, but everything matters and everything helps. So don't forget that accessibility is a spectrum, not a binary. And just because you can't achieve the perfect wheelchair accessible standards doesn't mean you should stop seeking out and eliminating any barriers to participation while you can. And that's it. Stop letting perfect be the enemy of good, and you'll be able to make even the most rugged and remote trails more accessible and enjoyable for more people. That's it. So I'll give it back to Sean to say any words or move into questions.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thank you for this presentation. I found it to be very insightful, and I appreciate the fact that you cover other, aspects of disability. It's not everybody. It's not all mobility. I mean, there are
Mm-hmm.
other, concerns people have for accessibility. So I really appreciate that you touched on other disabilities. So we can, yeah, head into questions. I do see in the chat that Lily has a question. If anyone, whether Peter or anyone in the group here, might know where to purchase custom trail blazes, specifically blazes that can be customized with color and shape.
So, and I did drop in the comments, one vendor is Voss Signs
Okay.
that we use frequently for that. More frequently, though, we make our own blazes for most of the trails that we maintain in New Jersey, at least. Those are either made with simple aluminum siding with paint or painted directly onto the trees. So, but if custom blazes, we usually reserve for things that have complex logos. If you want to have a QR code or a URL, then a vendor like Voss Signs can produce things on vinyl that are very helpful. But typically, all you need is a rectangle of aluminum or a rectangle painted on a tree, and that's good enough for most of the traditional hiking trails that we service.
Okay. You can drop questions in the chat if you'd like. Also, there is ability to raise your hand in the chat. So if you had questions or just, shout them out.
Okay, I'll stop sharing in a second, but I'll just, before I do, just put up here, we do have some resources that I think will be useful to people to do some more reading at your own leisure, to refer to as you tackle trail projects in your own area of interest. These are first the U.S. Forest Service's guidebooks that were discussed at length earlier, the U.S. Access Board as a great webpage full of resources. The Trail Conference has a webpage that's a general page for trail design and construction resources, but I've done my best to populate that for a specific section on accessibility that has links to things I found useful. Everything from broader presentations like this to much more granular technical things like the exact specifications for vendors to make accessible wheelchair crush mix for surfacing a trail. So at any point, that should be a good resource for technical questions, or you can just email the Trail Conference and we will do our best to get back to you. And that's it. I'll stop sharing.
Also appreciate the fact that you mentioned Maya and Ziv. I am actually working with her to actually have her do a presentation for the forum in the coming months. So those who are interested, keep an eye out for that.
That's great. Yeah, and I really want the takeaway, like I said, is just to kind of demystify what accessibility means, to remove that intimidation factor that a lot of both land managers and volunteers and trail builders feel when they hear about accessibility. You can sometimes see there's ooh, that's going to make it really expensive, or that's going to make it a really big project. And the goal here is to say there are lots of things we can do without having, everything look like paved concrete. There's lots of traditional trail building techniques that lead to improved accessibility.
See that Mackenzie has her hand raised.
Sorry, it took me a while to figure out how to raise my hand in Zoom.
I'm sorry.
So sorry. Do you feel like there are any regulations in our state that make it more difficult, or policies or anything that make it more difficult for us to make more accessible and more sustainable trails?
Yes, absolutely. So one issue with trail construction is increasingly, and there are good things about this. There's a lot more attention and regulation on the environment in New Jersey, which means that any project is going to have a lot more scrutiny in terms of the impacts on water flow, flood hazard areas, impacts to wetlands. So even small trail projects are going to have to go through a lot of review. Sometimes up here we have the Highlands Council. I know there's Pinelands preservation rules in place. There's coastal areas. The issue is that sometimes all of these well-intentioned rules can contradict each other to the point where progress is almost impossible, where you might have a requirement from a federal funding source that says the trail must be accessible. Then you have a flood hazard regulation saying, well, you can't disturb this square footage, which is what you'd have to do to make it accessible. And also it's in a historic area, so you can't touch this or alter this. And by the way, there's ground nesting birds, so you'd have to build it in the middle of December. So I think one of the difficult things is every regulation on its own is typically okay. Like you can always work with every regulation, but it's when you look at the sum of all the parts. And if you have the Highlands Act and you have a historic preservation area and you have a flood hazard, all of those things interact and can sometimes make it virtually impossible to comply with the flood or the historic or the environmental regulations. So in my area, it's the flood hazard rules that cause the most challenge. One of the biggest issues is bridges. There's a lot of hurdles with bridges, including the need often in New Jersey for the nonprofit or the project initiator to foot the bill for the permits, for the wetland delineation, for everything that goes into the environmental permitting and compliance. That can be very cost prohibitive. And as a result, we see a lot of things like stepping stones and a lot of things like more primitive crossings where you have to hop over logs. And that's, of course, not going to be accessible to anybody. So I would say one of the key things in New Jersey we need to do is figure out how to make the bridge building process less onerous and more affordable so that trails can continue to be accessible the first time they hit a water body, and every 2-foot wide stream doesn't cause an immediate stop to accessibility considerations. So I'd say those are the big ones. So the answer, Mackenzie, is yes, there are absolutely hurdles from a regulatory standpoint. And in my experience, bridges via the flood hazard area rules are the biggest one that we need to get through.
Thank you.
It's Alan. I don't have a camera. Sorry.
Are
You done, by the way?
Go ahead, Alan. I can hear you.
Okay, Ventnor, which is next to Atlantic City, just got a grant to open up a area in west of Ventnor, and they're going to start an eco park there. What's a good place for them to just start out comparing this with a new park versus rehabbing once they build the park?
I would defer to someone who has more local experience down there. If you saw our trail conference map, we're very much a northern region nonprofit in the state, but I'm sure there are lots of experts down there who can give more guidance, especially if there's going to be any coastal involvement. That'll have a lot of nuances. So I'm not sure, not to put you on the spot, Mackenzie, but maybe you can even answer the best place for Alan to start there.
My apologies. I was finishing taking my notes. Can you repeat your question? Sorry.
Ventnor just got a grant to open up an eco park in a section of wetland. So they're going to build a boardwalk and stuff like that there. But I was before, instead of retrofitting, once it's completed, what's a good place for them to look at to get this kind of measure start now so successful? Particularly to me, because I had a diabetic foot infection, so I'm not getting too well. But I love
I'm not positive, but you can send me an email and I can find out. And I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah, I was also going to say you could shoot me an email, and I'll do some research and help you out.
Okay, I'm not hooked up with anybody there yet, so I did my own research just to find out who's running the show there. But I read about it in the newsletter, so I'm going to get involved if I can. Like I said, right now I'm pretty laid up, but I'm hoping to get better. To get back, I basically need to be able to walk her from that. So that's it.
Okay. So I'm going to thank Mackenzie. I apologize for outing you. I'm not sure if you're here in your public work hat, but Mackenzie's email is in the chat right now, trails@DEP. And one very helpful thing that DEP offers are pre-application meetings. So it may be very helpful to meet with someone who is very familiar with the permits and things that are going to be triggered by the project, and they can issue guidance on what the next steps are going to be and what structures might or might not be suitable for that location.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Good. I see a few more chats. So yes, I see, Marion Jordan, we have Sean said the meeting's recorded, and the PDF that Sean's going to send around will also have some resources at the very end, which will link to things that are probably going to be very helpful with that question.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Unmute yourself if you do.
Well, did you put up your email?
My email's not there. I can drop that in the chat.
Mr. Holland.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'm doing that right now.
I don't know. You said you don't, hit down here, so let's see, you'll get involved with this. That's good. Okay, thanks.
That is not correct. Sorry.
All right. Well, while Sean corrects the email address, any other questions?
All right, I have one more question. Is there anything that you see done in New York that you think that we could, in terms of accessibility and sustainable trail design, that we could use as a model here in New Jersey?
Oh, that's a tough thing to answer without touching sensitive words like budgets. So I will say that is one big difference. New York State seems to prioritize public land and open spaces, and accessible trails often do require more funding for one reason or another, because of the nature of the technical design, because of the structures that are involved. there's often going to be a more involved hands-on staff and compliance component and engineering often to an accessible project. My experience in New Jersey has been that that sort of compliance, engineering, and planning often falls on the nonprofit group or the partner group that wants to do the project. New York will often take a proposal and they have staff internally and they have compliance folks who will handle the necessary permits, the approvals, the engineering, and they can return that back to the public. So that's what I would say is the biggest difference is who the burden falls on to execute a project. New York tends to have a more active role in seeing projects through to conclusion, whereas New Jersey will sometimes allow projects to happen, but isn't going to do as much to bring them over to completion. And that's my experience. I've worked for a very specific type of organization in a very specific region. So that's certainly not the case everywhere for every project, but thinking of more what I call primitive trail projects, that's normally been the case. So that's the biggest thing I can say is more hands-on role from New York State Park staff in providing guidance and compliance assistance to project partners.
Thank you again.
Yep.
So I don't see any more questions in the chat. Is there anyone out there that wants to vocalize a question or? All right. Well, thank you all for attending this Access Nature Forum. I hope to see you all in future forums. So have a nice evening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this chat.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.